Welcome back to the channel. We're here with another sourdough video. I made a tutorial not too long ago, but since then I've gotten the hang of this filming thing a bit better, so hopefully this one's a little better than the last. So we're just gonna start off with my active sourdough starter. I've had this starter for probably 6 months or so now. This is the key component to making a good sourdough bread. You need an active starter. If you make your own starter and you notice that it's struggling, it probably won't make you the best loaf. Trust me, I've tried. So I actually went and got a little bit of sourdough from King Arthur Bread Company or Flour Company. They will send you a little bit of their active starter and then they send you feeding instructions, and that's what got me this really nice active starter. So I would recommend, if you don't have an active starter, contact a friend who does or get some from King Arthur. There's a lot of places that you can get it. I think many places on Etsy have it as well. So we're gonna start with our 1 1/3 cup of water. This recipe makes 1 loaf. So for anyone just wanting to start making sourdough, this is a good method because you won't waste too much if it doesn't go well. I'm gonna take the active starter here. Let me show you how nice and bubbly it is. We're going to go in with 1/2 cup into our 1 1/3 cup of water. Now I really just figured this out the other day, but so this recipe that I'm basing my tutorial off of is actually from Farmhouse on Boone, and in her recipe it calls for 3½ cups of flour, and I noticed every time I made this recipe that I never needed 3½ cups. I always stopped at around 3 cups of flour, and that was like a good consistency, and I was always wondering why. Well, that's because you'll notice that some people's starters are more runny or more thick than others, so their feeding ratios are a little bit different. So if you prefer like a thicker starter texture, you'll have a drier ratio of your starter, so you won't need as much flour in your dough, if that makes sense. So we're just gonna mix this up. So once everything is all mixed up, we are going to add our flour. I use all-purpose flour. I know there's some people out there that will call for specific kinds of flour. I don't find that you need the bread flour. I have used it in the past, but I typically use all-purpose and it turns out great. So once I get to 2½, I typically start to mix the dough. Just in case I didn't feed my starter with the exact same ratio, you can always add more flour, but you can never take flour out after you've mixed it, obviously. So we're just gonna go in and see what kind of consistency this is giving me. This definitely needs more flour. Pretty wet consistency. You don't want it that wet. So let's go in with another 1/2 cup. And for those of you who don't really love to get your hands messy, I don't know, I kind of hate to break it to you, it's best to get your hand in there and get this mixed together. You can mix it up to a certain point with, you know, a spoon, a fork, a whisk, whatever you have, but it's really best to get your hands in there. Okay, and this actually, in my opinion, needs a little bit more flour. I fed my starter last night, and you know, I probably just fed it with a little bit more water than I normally do, so that's okay. Like I said, you can always add flour, but you can never take it out once you put it in. So once you get to about this consistency, start to just slowly add some flour and see how it affects your texture. I think that'll do it for me. This is about the texture that we want, kind of a slightly shaggy ball, but not too shaggy, because over time your dough will start to hydrate more. The flour will start to take in more of that water. So shaggy, not too shaggy, definitely not too wet either. And guys, you can make a more hydrated loaf. It's just more difficult to deal with, and if you're a beginner, starting out with not too hydrated of a dough is ideal because you'll be able to handle it easier when the shaping and the stretching and folding part comes. So I'm just gonna clean my hands off and then cover this with some plastic wrap and then leave it alone for 30 minutes. All right guys, it's been 30 minutes. We're ready to stretch and fold. So I'm just going to wet my hand a little bit. So once your hand's wet, what you're gonna wanna do is slide your hand down the side of the bowl. Pick up your dough and then fold it back in on itself. So when you're doing this, it's like you can see that it's smoothing out the texture of your dough. And I usually go around like a few times. We do like every quarter turn and pick up a new area and stretch it and fold it again. This dough is actually a little bit more wet than I usually handle, but I think that it'll be okay. Alright, so for the second stretch and fold, I usually add my salt at this point. So we're adding about 2 teaspoons of salt. Sometimes I'll add this like pre-dissolved in water, but this dough isn't a dry dough, so I don't really want to add any more water to it. So I'm just adding my salt, and now I'm going to stretch and fold while trying to mix that salt into the dough. You want it to be, eventually you don't want to be able to feel the salt in there, because you know, obviously that'll indicate that it is distributed throughout your dough. So while we're stretching and folding, let's talk about the timing of all this. So usually I don't do this on a weekend, I'll do it on a weekday, and like most people, I work the typical 9-to-5 job. So I know for a lot of people, the timing of this is a deterrent because it does take up a lot of time. You know, it's 6 hours here, 4 hours there. So let's talk about it. I will feed my starter in the morning when I wake up before I go to work. So that'll be like 6:30 in the morning, I'll feed my starter. By the time I come home, it'll be about 12 hours from when I fed it, and that's when your starter should be nice and active. And that's when I start my dough. So I'll start my dough at probably 7 p.m. I'll go through this whole process. It takes 2 hours from start to finish, mixing your dough and doing a stretch and fold every 30 minutes. And then after that, I just let it bulk ferment overnight, and then I do the rest of it in the morning. So we'll go over the rest of this recipe when I come back after my next 2 stretch and folds. I'll probably do off camera, and then we'll be back. All right guys, I just finished my last stretch and fold. So I'll insert a picture of the size of the dough so you guys can see it a little bit better, but I'm going to wait for this to double in size. So it's going to be bulk fermenting for probably 6 hours. Usually I'll do this during the week, I'll do it overnight, and we cool the house down overnight, so I'm not worried about it over fermenting because our house is probably like 64 degrees. But today, since it's the weekend and it's currently 68 in the house and I'm putting it in a nice warm spot, we're gonna check back in 6 hours and then we'll get to shaping. All right guys, it's several hours later and the dough has certainly doubled in size, so we are going to shape it. This is a little bit more wet than I usually like my dough, but hopefully I'll be able to handle it. Put some flour down. Usually I like to use a little tool to scrape the dough out if I need to, which I usually do. Here she comes. Alright, so once you get your dough out of the bowl, you're going to flatten it into like a rectangular, kind of like if you're making a pizza dough. If your dough comes out a little bit wet, definitely flour your surface so that it doesn't stick too bad. Now I'm going to flip it over, and we're going to fold long ways towards me, and then away, and then flip it vertical, and then roll it up kind of like a croissant. And then once you've rolled it up like this, you want to build tension in the dough, so you're going to push it away from you and then pull it towards you. Push, pull. and this creates tension to keep the shape. You can leave it like this and then skip on to the next step, but what I'm gonna do here is this is like my pre-shape, so I'm just gonna do it kind of rough, not super perfect. A tiny little bit of flour on it. Flip it. Put a tea towel over it and then let it rest for 20 minutes, and then we'll repeat this process but a little bit more delicately. I'll be back. Alright, it's been 20 minutes and we're gonna do that process over again, but this time we're not gonna stretch it out as much. We're just gonna stretch it a little bit just so that we can do the fold and the roll. And the more you get used to doing this, the more you can handle like a more wet dough and experiment with different flours in ratios, because the more hydrated your dough, the more open the crumb will be, and obviously vice versa. So the more dry your dough, or less hydrated I should say, it's never dry, but the tighter knit the crumb will be. You'll want to stitch your dough to keep the tension. If you find that when you're stitching it, it's not sticking together, let the dough rest for just 10 minutes or so, and then do your stitching. And then I'm going to take a damp tea towel and put that over the top. Alright, so it is the morning. I'm voicing this over because there was just a lot going on, but I took my dough out of my cold proofing situation and it proofed really nicely, so I'm going to turn it out on my parchment paper. I'm just going to crumple it up before using it, which is something that someone actually commented on my last sourdough video, so thank you for that comment. I can't believe I never thought of it. If you want to prevent your parchment paper from rolling up on you, crumple it before you use it. And then I went ahead and I scored my dough. I thought I got a close-up of me scoring it and I ended up not recording, so I'm sorry about that. But I will then put my dough, as soon as I score it, I will put it into my preheated Dutch oven. So preheat your Dutch oven at 500 degrees for about 30 minutes at least. Put it into the oven at 500 for 20 minutes. And then I am going to pull out the loaf, and this is where you're going to take the lid off so that you can get that nice crust on your bread. When you put it back in, make sure you put the temperature down to 450 degrees. Pop it in for 12 to 15 minutes or longer, depending on how, brown you want your crust to be. But then you get a really nice crispy loaf. And guys, this was one of the more hydrated loaves I've ever made, and I honestly, I didn't mean to make it this hydrated. It was just my starter ratio the night prior. I must have fed it more water than normal. But go ahead and bake that loaf because this was delicious. It was one of the more soury sourdough breads that I've made, and it was really good, and we ate it all in 2 days. So bake those loaves. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope this one was a little bit better than my previous tutorial, and I hope you gained the confidence to just bake your loaf. So thanks for joining me. I'll see you guys in the next one.